In the final months of 1945, Japan was a nation standing on the edge of exhaustion. Cities across the country lay in ruins after relentless bombing campaigns. Food supplies were diminishing, the military was overwhelmed, and civilians lived each day in uncertainty. Yet despite the hardships, the people of Hiroshima still believed their city held a measure of safety. It was home to major military headquarters, shipyards, and industrial facilities. Many residents assumed the Americans would avoid destroying a city they might later want to occupy. Among the thousands working in Hiroshima was a 29-year-old engineer named Tsutomu Yamaguchi. For 3 long months he had been away from his family, living in Hiroshima while designing oil tankers for Mitsubishi Heavy Industries. He had arrived in the city as a temporary assignment, never expecting to witness the defining moment of the modern age. On the evening of August 5th, exhausted and eager to see his wife and infant son, he packed his belongings. His plan was simple: spend his final workday at the shipyard and catch the train home. The next morning, August 6th, dawned warm and bright. The sky above Hiroshima carried no trace of threat. Commuters filled the trams, shopkeepers opened their doors, and schoolchildren ran through the streets. The atmosphere felt strangely calm for a country at war. Air raid alarms had not sounded. No aircraft approached the city in formation. There was nothing to suggest that history's first atomic attack was minutes away. Shortly after 8 o'clock, Yamaguchi walked toward the shipyard entrance. He had just been stopped by a guard for forgetting his identification papers when he heard a distant hum. He looked upward. A single, silver aircraft glided high over the city. It was an American B-29 bomber, but it flew alone, too solitary to resemble a typical bombing raid. As he watched, a small, dark object detached from the plane and began to fall in a gentle arc toward the city's center. He squinted, confused. Then, in an instant, the world dissolved into blinding white. A flash erupted across the sky with a brilliance no human had ever seen. For a fraction of a second, everything vanished: buildings, streets, shadows, even the line of the horizon. Light swallowed matter itself. Yamaguchi felt heat tear across his body like a burning wind. Before he could react, the shock wave struck. A wall of force slammed into him, flipping him into the air and hurling him into a nearby field. He felt his eardrums rupture. He felt his skin peel. And he felt the horrifying silence that followed, as if the world had exhaled every breath it had left. When he finally opened his eyes, Hiroshima had transformed into something unrecognizable. Smoke blanketed the sky. Buildings had collapsed into smoldering heaps. Flames leapt from shattered timbers. People stumbled through the ruins with their bodies burned, their clothing melted into their skin. Many were too shocked to scream. Others whispered for water, unable to comprehend what had happened. Yamaguchi, still dazed, pushed himself upright. His left side had been burned by the flash. His arm throbbed with pain, and his face felt raw and blistered. He had been less than 3 kilometers from the hypocenter. Anyone much closer had already been vaporized. He moved through the debris with trembling legs, calling out for his co-workers. Among the twisted metal of the shipyard, he found several engineers lying motionless. Others cried out from beneath collapsed structures. Yamaguchi tried to help, but the devastation was overwhelming. Entire buildings had been flattened. Machinery was scattered across the ground like broken toys. Fires spread faster than survivors could outrun them. As the minutes passed, a sense of dread settled over the city. A strange, black rain began to fall, radiation-soaked soot that drifted from the rising mushroom cloud. Survivors looked skyward, watching a towering column of smoke grow taller and wider, twisting into a shape no one could explain. Rumors spread quickly. Some insisted it was a new American weapon. Others believed the city had been hit by a gigantic explosion from within. No one could imagine a scientific device capable of producing such destruction. Yamaguchi made his way toward the center of Hiroshima, searching for medical help. Every step felt heavier than the last. The heat from the blast had burned through his clothes, leaving him barely dressed. His skin clung painfully to the fabric that remained. The streets were clogged with rubble and bodies. People lay along the sidewalks, too injured to move. Many had their arms extended in front of them, their skin hanging in long strips. Others sat in stunned silence, their faces ghostly pale beneath layers of ash. At a makeshift aid station, a doctor wrapped Yamaguchi's burns with oily rags, the only material available. The doctor had no answers, no medicine, and almost no supplies. Hospitals across Hiroshima had been destroyed in the blast. Medical staff were wandering the ruins, treating patients wherever they could. Despite his injuries and the chaos surrounding him, one thought dominated Yamaguchi's mind. He had to return to Nagasaki. His family had no idea what had happened in Hiroshima. He needed to tell them he was alive. And he needed to leave the city before disease, fire, or radiation claimed him as well. That evening, barely able to stand, he made his way to Hiroshima Station. The station had been damaged but not completely destroyed. Survivors flooded the platforms, desperate to escape. Many were too weak to walk. Others collapsed as they waited for a train that might never arrive. But eventually, a battered locomotive pulled in, its windows cracked and its paint scorched. Yamaguchi climbed aboard. As the train rattled westward, he watched Hiroshima fade behind him. Smoke still rose in the distance, blotting out the sky. The scale of the destruction remained beyond comprehension. He wondered how a single bomb could annihilate an entire city in seconds. He wondered if anyone he knew had survived. He wondered if he himself would survive the journey home. Yet even as he left Hiroshima, something unimaginable awaited him. The very weapon that had just shattered his life in one city would soon meet him again in another. Nagasaki still stood unscarred. His wife and child still lived there, unaware that a second bomb was already being prepared. And Tsutomu Yamaguchi, burned, exhausted, and clinging to life, was heading home into the path of another atomic attack. When the train carrying Tsutomu Yamaguchi finally approached Nagasaki, dusk had begun to settle across the hills that surrounded the city. The soft evening light created a peaceful contrast to the scenes he had just escaped. Unlike Hiroshima, Nagasaki was untouched. The streets were intact, the homes still standing, and the quiet hum of daily life drifted from the neighborhoods near the harbor. It felt as though he had stepped from one world into another, from the edge of annihilation into a place unaware that the war was entering its final and deadliest stage. Yamaguchi, still bandaged and weak, walked slowly from the station toward his home. Every movement sent sharp waves of pain across the burns on his arm and face. His legs felt unsteady beneath him. Yet a sense of relief pushed him forward. He was alive, and soon he would see his wife, Hisako, and their baby son. As he neared the house, Hisako rushed outside. Shock filled her expression as she saw his burns and the tattered remains of his clothing. He explained, as best he could, the unimaginable destruction he had witnessed in Hiroshima, not knowing how to describe a light that erased an entire city or a blast that tore reality apart. That night, the couple stayed awake, trying to make sense of what he had survived. Hisako treated his wounds with what little supplies they had. Yamaguchi's skin was swollen and blistered, and he struggled with dizziness and nausea. Hisako urged him to rest, believing that everything would make more sense after sleep. But as dawn approached, Yamaguchi knew he had to return to work. Despite the chaos in Hiroshima, the Mitsubishi office in Nagasaki expected him to report in and finalize the documents for the tanker project. On the morning of August 9th, he limped toward the Mitsubishi headquarters. His body ached with every step. The memory of the Hiroshima flash still haunted him, replaying in sickening bursts. He tried to describe the weapon to his supervisor, a man who listened politely but skeptically. Yamaguchi insisted that a single bomb had destroyed Hiroshima. His supervisor frowned, shook his head, and replied that such a thing was impossible. No weapon could erase an entire city. Yamaguchi had to be exaggerating, confused from trauma. As his supervisor began explaining why Yamaguchi's story could not be true, a sudden, brilliant light filled the office. It was 11:02 a.m. A second atomic bomb, code-named Fat Man, detonated over Nagasaki. The flash was blinding, less white than the Hiroshima blast, more golden, but equally devastating. The windows of the Mitsubishi building shattered instantly. The walls shook violently. The shockwave crashed through the structure like a hurricane of glass and steel. Yamaguchi was thrown from his feet once again. The walls buckled. Files and desks flew across the room. Dust filled the air so thickly that breathing became a struggle. For a moment, Yamaguchi believed he had died. The blast felt identical to the one he had experienced only 3 days earlier. The pressure, the heat, the suffocating silence that followed. His ears rang with a piercing, high-pitched whistle. When he opened his eyes, the office was in ruins. His co-workers lay scattered across the floor, some unconscious, others crying out in pain. Yet, incredibly, Yamaguchi himself remained alive. The sturdy concrete of the Mitsubishi building had shielded him from the direct fireball. If he had been standing outside, he would have been burned to ash. Staggering to his feet, he made his way through the wrecked interior and out into the streets. Nagasaki, like Hiroshima, had transformed in an instant. Homes had been flattened. The valley geography of the city had created pockets of intense destruction and pockets of partial survival. Entire neighborhoods burned while others remained strangely intact. Dark smoke rose into the atmosphere, forming a massive column that twisted upward and spread into the familiar mushroom shape he had seen over Hiroshima. He watched it rise with a chilling recognition. No one else around him understood what had happened. People screamed, wandered in confusion, or helped the injured to their feet. But Yamaguchi knew. He had seen this destruction before. The weapon that had obliterated Hiroshima had now been used again, against the very city where he had believed he would be safe. His first thought was of Hisako and their child. Without hesitation, he began pushing through the narrow streets toward his neighborhood. Fires crackled along the roadsides. Wires hung from broken poles. Injured civilians lined the sidewalks, shielding their eyes from the smoke. The heat from the blast still radiated from the ground. Yet Yamaguchi pushed onward, driven by the fear that his family had been caught in the explosion. The bridge he needed to cross was partially destroyed, but still standing. He forced himself over it, slipping past fallen debris until he finally reached his home. The wooden structure had survived, protected by a hill that shielded it from the full force of the explosion. Hisako was inside, holding their son tightly. They had both survived. Yamaguchi sank to the floor, overwhelmed with relief. Hisako cried in disbelief, clinging to him as she inspected the fresh injuries he had gained. His bandages were torn, his burns worsened, and a new wound bled along his shoulder. Twice now, he had been at the edge of the atomic blasts. Twice he had survived. As evening descended, the family listened to distant explosions and collapsing buildings as the fires continued to spread across Nagasaki. Radio broadcasts offered only fragments of information. Rumors circulated about American announcements, about a new type of bomb, about Japan's uncertain future. Yamaguchi knew the truth before the government confirmed it. The era of warfare had changed forever. The weapon that had destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki was beyond anything humanity had ever seen. In the days that followed, the scale of the devastation became clear. Thousands were dead. Thousands more were gravely injured. Hospitals overflowed. Supplies dwindled. People drank contaminated water, unaware of the invisible danger lingering in the air and on their skin. And throughout it all, Yamaguchi's condition worsened. His burns grew infected. His hair began to fall out. He suffered from fevers and violent nausea, signs of acute radiation exposure. Yet somehow he lived. By surviving both atomic bombs, Tsutomu Yamaguchi had become a symbol of unimaginable resilience. But the weight of what he had witnessed, twice, would remain with him for the rest of his life. The world had changed in 3 days, and he had been forced to stand at the center of its most catastrophic turning point. In the days that followed the destruction of Nagasaki, a heavy, unnatural silence settled over the city. The fires that had raged through neighborhoods slowly burned themselves out, leaving behind fields of ash and twisted metal. Blackened tree trunks leaned against the edges of streets that no longer resembled streets. The contours of Nagasaki had changed, reshaped by the force of a weapon few people understood. Even the air seemed unfamiliar, filled with dust and particles that glimmered faintly in the sunlight. Inside his damaged home, Tsutomu Yamaguchi lay weak and feverish. The burns he had suffered in Hiroshima, aggravated by the second explosion, had begun to peel and darken. His hair fell out in clumps. His vision blurred. He vomited frequently, unable to keep food down. Each symptom pointed to radiation sickness, though the term meant nothing to him then. Medicine had no words for the invisible wounds inflicted by the atomic bomb. His wife, Hisako, tried endlessly to care for him. She cleaned his burns with cloths soaked in well water, unaware that the water itself might be contaminated. Their infant son lay nearby, crying from hunger and confusion. The family had survived both blasts, but they faced a new threat, sickness that came not from heat or shock, but from the unseen poison that lingered in their bodies. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito addressed the nation by radio. His voice, calm yet strained, echoed through homes and shelters across Japan. He announced the unthinkable: Japan would surrender. The war was over. For many citizens, the words brought relief. For others, shame. But for survivors like Yamaguchi, the announcement carried a different gravity. The suffering they had endured was not a sacrifice for victory. It was the closing act of a war that had finally consumed itself. In the weeks that followed, the true scale of the atomic devastation became clearer. Government officials gathered sketches, photographs, and survivor reports. Scientists entered Hiroshima and Nagasaki wearing protective suits, taking measurements and samples. Foreign journalists arrived, documenting streets reduced to rubble and survivors whose bodies bore marks of unimaginable trauma. Medical teams attempted to treat radiation injuries but lacked the knowledge to truly help. No one had ever studied the long-term effects of such a weapon. The survivors became subjects in a global experiment no one had consented to. Yamaguchi's condition slowly stabilized. The fevers lessened. His burns began to heal, though they left scars across his face and arm. He remained weak for months, unable to work or walk long distances. His hearing, damaged in both explosions, never fully recovered. But with time, his strength returned enough for him to face the new Japan that was emerging from the ashes. The war was over, but the nation's struggle had only begun. Cities lay in ruins. Millions lacked homes or food. The psychological and emotional toll was immeasurable. Amid this environment of reconstruction, survivors of the atomic blasts, hibakusha, as they came to be known, carried a unique burden. Many were discriminated against because people feared they carried a contagious sickness. Others were rejected by employers who believed they were too weak to perform labor. Marriage prospects vanished for some, as families feared radiation might cause illness in future children. Yamaguchi experienced these struggles, yet he remained determined to rebuild his life. He returned to work for Mitsubishi, quietly resuming his engineering duties despite the constant pain in his burns and the fatigue that followed him like a shadow. His colleagues treated him with a mix of fascination and discomfort. Few people had survived one atomic bomb. No one knew of anyone who had survived two. For decades, Yamaguchi rarely spoke of his experiences. The memories were too heavy, too vivid. When he closed his eyes, he still saw the Hiroshima flash, the rising mushroom cloud, the ruined faces of the people stumbling through the streets. Nagasaki brought its own set of images, walls collapsing, shattered glass raining from the ceiling, smoke blotting out the sky. Silence became his way of coping. The world did not yet have space for such stories. As time passed, Japan changed, and so did the world's understanding of atomic warfare. The Cold War ushered in new fears, new weapons, new possibilities of destruction. Nuclear tests across the Pacific created clouds of fallout that drifted over oceans. Scientists debated whether humanity had entered an age where it could no longer control its own power. During this period, the testimonies of atomic survivors began gaining importance. Their voices served as reminders of what nuclear weapons truly meant, not an abstract geopolitical threat, but a force that reshaped bodies, families, and cities in an instant. It was in this era, many years after the bombings, that Yamaguchi finally began to tell his story publicly. He spoke at schools, community halls, and peace gatherings. His voice was gentle, deliberate, shaped by decades of reflection. He described the two blinding flashes, the heat that seared his body, the dust-filled silence afterward. He described the hospitals overflowing with the injured, the children calling for parents who would never arrive, the families walking barefoot through shards of glass in search of water. And he described the weight he carried from knowing he had survived twice when hundreds of thousands had not survived even once. In 2009, near the end of his life, the Japanese government officially recognized him as the only known person to have survived both atomic bombings. He was 93 years old. Journalists from around the world traveled to interview him. His story spread through newspapers, documentaries, and books. He became a symbol not of luck, but of endurance, proof of the human capacity to continue living even after encountering the unimaginable. Yet Yamaguchi was not interested in fame. His message was simple: nuclear weapons should never be used again. He spoke not with anger, but with a quiet, mournful conviction. He believed that humanity could not survive another Hiroshima, another Nagasaki. Not because nations lacked the strength to rebuild, but because the wounds inflicted by nuclear fire were not merely physical. They burned into the soul. In his final interviews, he recalled holding his infant son during the days after the Nagasaki bombing. He remembered wondering whether the radiation in his body would harm the child, whether the future he held in his arms had already been shaped by forces he could not see. His son survived and lived a full life, but the fear never completely left him. It lived alongside the memories, one more invisible scar. Tsutomu Yamaguchi passed away in 2010. He had lived through two of the most devastating moments in human history and carried their memory for 65 years. His survival was not a miracle in the traditional sense. It was a testament to resilience, to the fragility and strength of the human body, and to the will to live even when the world collapses twice around you. Today, the story of Tsutomu Yamaguchi stands as one of the most powerful reminders of the cost of nuclear warfare. It is a story not only of suffering, but of survival, not only of destruction, but of the responsibility that comes with knowledge. He witnessed the dawn of the atomic age from its very center. And with the time he was given, he chose to use his voice to warn the world.